Hello viewers, and welcome to the long-awaited return of Watchtower in Focus. I've been meaning to do this for a while. I've been waiting for the right topic to come along, and we have, I feel, a really interesting topic to talk about, which is the 2017 annual meeting, the 133rd annual meeting of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. This is a huge event in the Jehovah's Witness calendar for reasons that we'll go into. But first of all, let me introduce our guests. We have joining us John Redwood from America.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing?
Not doing too badly, thank you. And we also have joining us from England, Covert Fade.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be back.
Hello, Covert. And for this episode, we are joined by JWsurvey's new survey editor, Chloe. Hello, Chloe.
Hello.
So what we've decided to do, with this being the 3.5-hour program for the annual meeting, we've decided to basically chop it up into its component parts, and each of us has been assigned our own talk to go over, and because it was just too much for one person or for indeed all of us in the time that's passed since the annual meeting, for us all to carefully research the whole thing. So rather than us all researching the whole thing, we've all got our own parts that we're going to be commenting on. Just a little bit more on the annual meeting. I don't know whether you'd like to weigh in on this, John. The significance, and I think in the past it's been more of a legal thing, and indeed it probably still does have a legal element, but certainly in the past few years it's been used as almost like an Apple launch for the governing body to release changes in understanding or new publications.
Yeah, it really has. It's been going on for decades and decades now, especially with the implementation of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society Corporation of Pennsylvania. And I think many of us that have been in the organization for a long time will remember the announcements that are made or were made every month or every year in the Kingdom Ministry that said, you know, the proxies are being sent out for the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. And everybody kind of wondered, well, what's that all about? Well, it was a behind the scenes meeting that took place in addition to the public meeting. But as you said, the public meeting became more of the spectacle, the annual meeting. And if you had a ticket or an invitation to go to New York to the annual meeting or were connected to it in some way, it was very special. And, it's in, I think, maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we saw the advent of the internet broadcasting, where Jehovah's Witnesses now had the ability to broadcast the annual meeting to all of the United States. So we had a Saturday and a Sunday program where, we saw about 1.5 million people that were joined together, and the organization had little electronic boxes that every congregation had to install and connect to a video projector. And so everybody got to watch the annual meeting instead of just a select few at New York.
Indeed. Thanks for that summary. You mentioned about the broadcasting. Unfortunately, this year's annual meeting wasn't broadcast in such a way that anyone could watch it. We have managed at JWsurvey to obtain an illicit recording, because that one of the things that's said at the beginning of the program is absolutely no recording. We've gone against that, unfortunately. So we do have a recording. I'm
probably the least of our transgressions against Watchtower.
Yes. I'm sure they'll find other things against us other than that.
Yeah, I'd like to mention about that too. It's interesting because I will say the recording did not come from an apostate source or a non-Jehovah's Witness source. It came from several active Jehovah's Witnesses. However, we have so many active elders and even those within the organization's headquarters in Bethel in New York and others, Bethel branches, who are actually what we call physically in, mentally out, that have been contributing information that, simply make an announcement not to record the annual meeting or not to disseminate this information on the internet. It's almost become a lost cause for the governing body because they can't stop the outflow of information since there's so many mentally awakened Jehovah's Witnesses in the organization now. So we're happy to see that, actually.
Yeah, that's true. I did just want to mention about the recording primarily so that viewers could understand a little bit about the format, because we are going to be playing clips from the recording. So we've been tasked, each of us, with finding, significant clips from each of the talks. Now, I'm hoping that by the time this video gets released, there's a possibility that I might be able to use videos in place of the audio clips. If you see audio clips rather than video, viewers, I'm afraid that there was no video released by Watchtower in time. So that's just an FYI to begin with. But let's get underway, shall we, with looking at the program. So the event was hosted by Jeffrey Jackson, who made some opening remarks, and right off the bat he decided, or the governing body decided, that he would release some new light about a scriptural understanding. John, could you take us through that?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because it was sort of like, let's release the hounds immediately and not wait. And typically when we're listening into annual meetings, we might hear an hour into the program or hour and a half that something new has happened, some change has occurred, or some revelation from Tony Morris about a restriction on tight pants and patterned socks. However, this time Jeffrey Jackson decided to come right out of the gate, and is right after the prayer by Gene Smalley, who, by the way, is a very long time member of the writing committee and is nearing the end of his life, but he is a very significant player in Watchtower policy on blood and on the 607-1914 doctrine. Well, he gives the opening prayer. And right after he completes that prayer, Jeffrey Jackson comes right out and says, well, what if Brother Smalley had prayed for the vindication of Jehovah's name? How would you have reacted? In other words, would it be wrong to say that Jehovah's name should be vindicated? And this is interesting because for many years, especially when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s in the organization, when someone gave a prayer and said, well, we pray for the vindication of God's name, Jehovah, or we pray for the sanctification of your name, the organization felt that it was necessary to make a distinction between what it means to vindicate God's name and what it means to sanctify God's name. And it all really comes back to the scripture that says, let your name be sanctified, let your will be done. So for years, people prayed for the sanctification of God's name, but then they also prayed for the vindication of God's name, Jehovah. So what happened there was that Jeffrey Jackson, within the first minute, said that it is no longer incorrect to pray for the vindication of Jehovah's name. And I thought that was really fascinating. In fact, he referenced the fact that the 1965 Awake said that it would be wrong to pray for the vindication of God's name because it doesn't need to be vindicated. And also the 1995 Watchtower, that was a significant one. In fact, it said in that Watchtower, it was the May 15th, 95 Watchtower, it said it was not the name of Jehovah that was challenged and that needed to be vindicated. So this was a very bold statement that was made, and there was a long explanation as to why we would not pray for the vindication of Jehovah's name. It doesn't need to be vindicated. And now we've turned 180 degrees opposite, and suddenly it's appropriate to say, Jehovah, let your name be vindicated. So we're getting into all of these word plays and semantics. Yeah. And I thought what was interesting was at the very beginning, Jackson said that this was only for the English-speaking audience. So we know that the translation of the New World Translation that goes into Spanish and other languages, has a different taint because it's actually translated from English to those languages, not from Hebrew and Greek to those languages. So
Sure.
they're able to control exactly what they want to say with regard to that. So now we have a complete 180-degree reversal, saying that Jehovah's name, it's okay because his name and reputation have been damaged. So it's now okay to pray for the vindication of his name.
So if you were losing sleep on that
too late.
point, if that was something that was genuinely stressing you out as to whether you could say that Jehovah's name should be vindicated, well, you can rest easy now. No, seriously, I thought that was a really tedious... In fact, if you're watching this, by the way, and you've never been a Jehovah's Witness, Jehovah's Witnesses perhaps are just an interest to you, and you're thinking, how boring is this? What on earth have I tuned into? You're not alone. I think it's boring too. I can remember.
Yeah.
I can remember going to ministerial training school when I was a witness, and this was one of the points that was brought up, and I'd never heard of it up until that point. But essentially, they were, again, as John says, engaging in word games and putting this huge significance on whether you could say that God's name, Jehovah, could or should be vindicated, because their argument was, well, Jehovah is Jehovah, he's the God of the universe, he doesn't need anybody to vindicate who he is or what his name is. So this is the sort of tedium that you need to be familiar with to some extent, especially if you're an elder in the organization. But that was right off the bat a new change in understanding. Now, following those opening remarks, there was a Watchtower Summary. Now, John, you were assigned to also look at this, but you came back to me and said there was very little interesting about the Watchtower Summary by Brother Glockentine, is it? His name was?
Yes, Glockentine. He's not a very prominent Jehovah's Witness member, but in New York he is. It was a typical Watchtower study, and this is something that sort of is a pivotal talk that's always given, whether you have a special circuit assembly or a district or a regional assembly. You always have the study of the Watchtower, which is a weekly ritual. And that's something that many cults engage in, is these weekly rituals or yearly rituals, whatever you want to call them, and that binds them together and it makes them give testimonials. And really, that's what this Watchtower study was about. It was the August 27th Watchtower entitled, Are We Willing to Wait Patiently on Jehovah? And so they went about giving their comments. And what was interesting about this one was that they chose to use what are called governing body helpers and their wives to give their testimonials or comments, as they're known in the Jehovah's Witness world.
So there was kind of like a hierarchy, even in just the way the Watchtower Summary was done. So that you could only really be involved if you were in the top rungs of the Watchtower hierarchy.
Yeah. For those that don't know, you have the governing body members, but then this was a program specific to the United States branch. So you have a United States branch committee, which consists of about 25 men only. And these men are the ones that gave the comments or testimonials during this Watchtower study, in which they went paragraph by paragraph. So we have some familiar names like William Malenfant, William Turner, David Schaefer, Chris Maver, Alex Reinhold, and then their wives gave supplementary comments. A few of them just read a scripture. But I thought it was really patronizing at the end. We had Jeffrey Jackson, who concludes the whole thing by saying that the sisters, or the women, referred to as sisters, who commented, they were helpers to the governing body. So, it's just a very misogynistic, patronizing way to treat women, that, how wonderful it was that they gave women the opportunity to hold a microphone and read a scripture or give up, a pre-screened comment, because these things are not done, these things are not done without preparation. They practice the exact comments in advance before they before they do this. So,
Well,
I don't know how
I'm actually glad that you told me that, John, because I didn't realize that they had women on stage, but essentially your only chance at being involved in the annual meeting program, if you were a woman, was if you just so happened to be married to one of the governing body helpers. Chloe, you've experienced firsthand the way women are demeaned at meetings, and surely this is something that you're rolling your eyes at.
I was actually going to bring this up if John didn't bring it up, because I just thought, like you said, helpers of the helpers, as if they can't do anything in their own right. If you're an unmarried woman, then really you have nothing to say on any of these things. And as somebody now who, I see myself as someone who has my own opinion with my own, contribution to give. So it's just, like you say, I'm rolling my eyes at that comment when he said that. And there's plenty of others throughout the whole thing, to be honest.
Yeah, we're only just getting warmed up. In fact, it's your turn next, Chloe. You were tasked with looking at the next item on the programme. I don't really know how to describe this. It was essentially hosted by Jeffrey Jackson, and it was a look at some of the videos regarding the construction of the Warwick headquarters, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Essentially, he gave an introduction to these two videos, talking about all the different, logistics and the numbers and what they've built. And he wanted to give a special thanks to all the people who'd contributed to the building work other than at Warwick. So there's Walk Hill, and he gave, statistics and said one of them that just stood out to me was that they have 1.1 million square feet of facilities just in Walk Hill. So that's insane to me. Anyway, and then he goes through the amount of volunteers and the Bethelites who are working Saturdays, as well as volunteering all of their other time, Monday to Friday, for all this work. And it was phenomenal, the amount of time that actually people gave to these projects. Further through the talk, before he introduced the first video, he talked about some various awards that they got as well, talking about the highest award of 4 Green Globes from the Green Building Initiative in 2015. And then he did go on to say that we achieved the highest of the high marks for this. And they always go on about that at Bethel, don't they, when you go on the tour? We're the cleanest, and we're always very, very prepared, and all of that sort of thing. And then he did go on to say after that, and that was just since 2015, and there've been many more since then. So who knows what the real information is on that.
Well, we know that Watchtower likes its awards, don't we? So
yeah,
especially if they're genuine awards, which it sounds like they are on this occasion.
Yeah. Then, do we want to go into the first clip?
Sure. So we're going to now play our first clip, and these, if I'm correct in saying, these clips are from people who were involved in managing the Warwick project, and we're going to play the first clip.
I'll never forget the night that Troy called in our room and said that one of our volunteers that were going to be arriving, they were fixing a tire alongside the road back at their home, and the brother's young wife was holding the flashlight. Car veered off the road, hit her, killed her right in front of him.
Yeah, he had already been invited and already scheduled to come. But when this happened, we didn't expect him to come. And we reassured him that it's okay to stay back and handle matters. But he was determined to come. What was amazing was to see how Jehovah helped him during that time. His overseers that were assigned to care for him and the department he worked with, they rallied to him. And in the end, he says he felt that this experience helped him to recover emotionally, spiritually, and he saw Jehovah's blessings in it. And it gave him pure evidence that Jehovah's promises will come true.
So what we've just heard was a really tragic story of a couple who were invited to work on the project, and as you heard, the lady actually ended up dying quite tragically by the roadside holding a flashlight while they dealt with a breakdown. And her husband continued on and worked on the project. Now, there's been a little bit of talk as to whether they were actually on their way to work on the project. I don't think that's clear from what we've just heard. It sounds like it could have been entirely unrelated to the Warwick project, but it's nonetheless quite tragic. And it kind of highlights in a way that, as if it needed to be highlighted, that witnesses are by no means immune from this sort of tragedy happening. But we are now just going to listen to another brief clip and some interesting claims that were made about the work on the project and the extent to which it received divine backing.
I sometimes try to imagine the conversations in heaven between the angels and the kings in heaven, and how they're so proud of all these workers down here. And no doubt many of them were involved in the project. We think of the workers here on earth, but how about the workers in heaven? They may have been involved in more than a few times with safety issues, with legal matters. So Jehovah was proud of everyone, his universal family, both in heaven and on earth, with these projects.
So, Chloe, that was a quite remarkable claim that we've just heard. Am I right in saying that they are suggesting, not affirming, but suggesting that angels were involved in the work at Warwick?
Yeah, they talked all the way through all of the experiences, saying Jehovah's hand was involved in this, and Jehovah's hand was involved in that, and people could evidently see that. But then at the very end, they say this one person gives this. Oh, just imagine, they're probably involved in, in heaven, the kings and angels are probably organizing safety and legal matters. Who knows what they're involved in? And I have two things to pick. I thought that was strange, personally, that they would be involved in such minute kind of things. And also, they're involved in safety when this sister had died and her husband had come to the build straight after that. It just
one thing
kind
that
of
you
doesn't
could say,
match up, does it?
Sorry, I'm just going to leap in there. One thing that you could say, whether this
That's all right.
whether this sister died on site or not, if angels are guiding the project, you would think that their oversight doesn't end at the barriers of the site. You would think that they're able, if they're intervening, and this is a point I constantly make in my videos, either God is interventionist or he isn't. So if angels are intervening to the extent of dealing with health and safety, to the extent of dealing with even legal matters, why can't they keep all of Jehovah's Witnesses alive, particularly the ones who were involved in this project?
Yeah, exactly. And throughout this, it talks about the blessings, and people can see the blessings of this too. So that makes it even more clear. It would be strange to put that claim at the end there when something tragic, so tragic, happens as well.
Indeed.
And it's just one comment from me. Just to reaffirm, I think if anyone's been involved with the building of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the quick builds or anything else, I mean, I personally know of horrific accidents that have happened on Jehovah's Witness quick builds. In fact, I know of one fatality. So to suggest that angels are involved in the safety of quick builds is, well, I can think of many occasions when those angels must have been asleep on the job. And it's actually quite offensive for them to claim that angels are looking after Warwick, because clearly angels weren't looking after the other brothers and sisters on those other quick builds where people were horrifically injured, or in one case that I know of, fatally so. So it seems like to me like increasingly the governing body, I mean, I'll cover this a bit later, are just dashing off all the people that are involved in making talks, are dashing off claims without even really thinking about the implications of what they're saying. So yeah, that was just something from my perspective on it.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well. I remember growing up, we had a young man who was traveling back from the eastern shore from the ocean and was killed in a head-on automobile accident. And we were working on a quick build Kingdom Hall, a double Kingdom Hall, 25 years ago. And they stopped to make an announcement that this young man had died. And, there was a terrible pall that was cast over everyone. And, a moment of sadness, and then the project just went right back on, without skipping a beat. And we had a few years ago, a sister in our congregation had her brother, her physical brother, and his wife were also involved in a head-on collision, very not far from where the other one happened, and both of them died. And that was on a Saturday. The very next morning, the two of them were at the Kingdom Hall getting consoled naturally by their friends. But the fact that they hadn't, jumped in their car and gone and, 3 hours away to where their family was, they felt that their only source of comfort was their Jehovah's Witness family. And I think that's a lesson for all of us with the undue influence and the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses, so many stay because there is such a tight bond, such a tight community that they feel that there's no solace anywhere else except within the Jehovah's Witness organization. But it was rather disturbing because it actually was controversial that they came to the meeting the very next morning after her own brother and his wife were tragically killed. I think anyone else would be with their family. But this was not a witness. Her brother was not a witness who died, nor was his wife. And, I think it's rather disturbing. I can't imagine what his family thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth kind of leaping to, express the condolences to the poor widower. Not that he would probably be grateful to hear them from us, but it's worth just kind of planting that flag that a life lost is a life lost, and it's extremely sad and tragic. Yeah. And if we could have prevented it, we would have done. But there does just seem to be this tinge of exploitation, at least in the way the story is told, that he is immediately kind of it doesn't sound like he was influenced. If anything, they told him to stay back. But the fact that he kind of viewed the whole project as helping him, when in fact he was actually being exploited at a time when he really needed to be getting his thoughts in order, it just doesn't sit right.
Yeah, the wording that they said, they assured him that he didn't have to come and he could stay back to handle matters, was just strange wording for that kind of tragedy, which is exactly what it is. It's a tragedy, really. Not something to be glossed over.
Not at all. So we're going to move on in the program. And we basically have now a series of talks by governing body members. And first up was Garrett Loesch, who had the theme Expansion That Glorifies Jehovah. And listening in on this talk was Covert Fade. Covert, what were your thoughts?
Well, my overriding thought was, wow, this is really boring. Loesch is not the most dynamic speaker. And unfortunately, he decides to basically spend a lot of his time taking us on a tour of Bethel facilities and printing presses through the ages, which means that he spends a lot of time just telling us the dates at which buildings were bought, how big the square footage was, when they moved the printing press around. And he actually goes in quite a lot of detail as to this building's part of the worldwide headquarters, but this building's part of the American headquarters, but this building's part of and it struck me as a man who realized he had 20 minutes to fill, but only 15 minutes worth of material, and thought, well, I'll just rant off statistics for, I'll kill an easy 5 minutes. I'm not necessarily criticizing him, because I know occasionally I used to do that with some of my talks when I didn't have enough time to prep and needed 10 minutes as well. I can just, rant off these stats here and I'll be fine. He basically he contradicts himself, and he doesn't realize he's doing it. The talk is all about dedication. It's all about we're dedicating this new building, and the building's part of Jehovah's worldwide organization, and the organization is expanding. And then he goes on quite a large thing about how the organization has got all these construction projects going on, and we've got all these new branches being built. And I wish there's a kind of part of me wishes I could have flash cut and spliced in the footage of Sam Hurd saying that we regret to inform you that, we're going to have to cancel some projects and cancel some Kingdom Hall builds, which was said in the not too distant past.
Sorry,
so
did he really say that the organization is expanding?
Yes. He goes into quite a bit. He goes on quite a little bit of a PR piece about how the organization is expanding and growing, and he spins it in a way that sounds like there are more and more branches being built, and that all of the translation branches are expanding. Of course, we know behind the scenes, well, not even behind the scenes, they've admitted it that they've got rid of special pioneers. They're cutting district overseers. They're cutting Bethel staff. There's been some quite savage hacking going on behind the scenes. So it's a very strange thing. But if you listen to what Loesch is doing, it becomes clear he's doing a lot of cherry picking. So, for example, he talks about all of the many people flooding into the organization. He's trying to give the impression that the numbers are going up and up. And he talks about how they had 1.2 million in the memorial at the Congo, how they had 2.2 million to the memorial in Mexico. Of course, he doesn't mention the lands where all the stats are going down. We had,
which is not insignificant. We're talking about half of Europe. We're talking about Australia, Canada, New Zealand.
Yes. The very heartland of Jehovah's Witnesses, the growth is stagnant. The growth is so small as to be negligible. So Loesch is really cherry picking here to try and give an impression of growth. He's not telling any lies. He's just being very selective in what he says, which is something that anyone who's got a close, has been in association with Watchtower for a long time is very familiar with them doing. They don't usually lie. They just very selectively pick their facts. The interesting thing is, a lot of this is kind of him basically talking about how there's more people coming in. We're building all this stuff. Isn't it great? Isn't it great? And there's not much point really going into it in great detail because it was actually quite boring. But he said something which brought me up short, and he just kind of slipped it into his talk, seemingly out of nowhere.
Is this the clip?
This is the clip.
Okay,
and it made me stop it, rewind it, and play it again because I couldn't believe what I just heard.
With that fantastic introduction, let's play that clip.
All in the spiritual paradise sing Jehovah's praise without let up. It is as if they preach day and night. Isaiah 62:6 goes on to say, continuously all day long and all night long, they should not be silent. You who make mention of Jehovah, do not rest. Yes, we are determined not to be silent, not to rest, mentioning Jehovah. In chapter 60, verse 6 in Isaiah, we read, they will proclaim the praises of Jehovah. By preaching the good news and our expressions in kingdom halls, we all contribute to Jehovah's praise. Praising Jehovah is one of the primary objectives of our meeting attendance and our preaching activity. We understand that we do not primarily preach to save people's lives. Jehovah's praise is more important than the salvation of people. Why? Because Jehovah is more important than people.
Did I hear that correctly, Covert? Did he just say that Jehovah is more important than people?
He absolutely did. And he also said that praising Jehovah is more important than saving people. So let's just put this in context. So it's not just a matter of the fact that, vindicating Jehovah's sovereignty is more important than human life. Just praising him. Because what Loesch is actually saying is the work of praising Jehovah in the ministry is the fact that people get saved as a result is kind of a side fringe benefit. So I had to rewind it to listen to it again because I've heard some fairly cold-hearted things from various witnesses, but this seemed so off the cuff and flippant. I couldn't really, so I'll outlay why I think some Jehovah's Witnesses might try and defend what he said, and then I'll outline why that doesn't work. Some Jehovah's Witnesses will say, well, Jehovah's the most important person in the universe, and without his rulership, nothing will work. So yes, he's more important than human beings. But that's not what Loesch said. What Loesch said was the praise of Jehovah is more important than human salvation. So I'll put that into context. If you've got a captain on a ship, the captain is usually considered to be the most important person on the ship because he knows what he's doing and he can steer you all in the right direction. But if the praise of the captain is more important than the lives of the other people on the crew, what you have is an extremely narcissistic, sociopathic captain. If it's more important to be walking around saying, oh, the captain's wonderful, the captain's great, than it is to be pulling people who've fallen overboard, you have a problem. And this is the interesting thing. It's the one thing I think you realize the more and more you study the way Watchtower portrays God, and I have to admit, there are many different ways different people view God, different religions, different denominations. But it becomes very clear that Watchtower's portrayal of God, the way they see the God of the Bible, is as an incredibly narcissistic, sociopathic, self-obsessed dictator, basically. And this shows how it's got so into Loesch's consciousness that he doesn't even question that would be a crazy thing to say, that it's more important to praise God than save people's lives. And so it's one of those like flippant throwaway statements that he makes in 30 seconds and isn't really the focus of the talk, but it provides you this fascinating insight into how witnesses actually view God and how the way they teach you who God is, without getting into the wider debates of what all the different Bible scholars say about it, how their specific view of God is actually terrifying. If you met the person that the witnesses describe as God just walking down the street, you'd want to run screaming in the other direction.
Well, of all the governing body members I could pick to kind of deliver very coldly and calmly something that is outrageous, I probably would pick Garrett Loesch, because I've done videos in the past about he's said some pretty alarming things about Armageddon and burial teams after Armageddon and that kind of thing. I think I'd pick...
He's Captain Antimatter, isn't he?
Yeah, he said that... yeah, that's right, because Tony Morris said that at Armageddon, his experience in Vietnam informed him that people killed at Armageddon would look like human hot dogs. And Garrett Loesch said, this is all, by the way, I'll try and put links in the description. It'll be a nightmare, but it's worth it. Garrett Loesch said that there would be some kind of radiation that would get rid of the unpleasant parts of the cadavers so that all that's left are the bones, and then it falls to the burial teams to get rid of the bones, I guess. He's thought about it in a lot of detail, basically.
Yeah, that's actually a throwback to Watchtower teaching from the 1980s. That's in the publications, that Jehovah could use some sort of nuclear fission in order to execute his goals and clean up the earth. Although at the same time, he says, well, they say, well, Jehovah's Witnesses are going to be cleaning up the earth. So it's where's this balance between the angelic, Jehovah-sponsored cleanup using radiation? Because surely we can't just get rid of all the bodies that are going to be wiped out at Armageddon.
It's like here's a hint: when your religion is spending enough time thinking about how to clean up genocide, you're in the wrong religion.
Yeah. I think a lot of witnesses wouldn't think about this side of it, though, because I definitely didn't really think about it. Because when you look on the survey, I was looking through some of the responses last night, and a lot of people were saying, no, I don't want all non-Jehovah's Witnesses to die, and they don't really think about that aspect until you bring it up. And this is the same. It's not really about saving people, it's all about just praising Jehovah's name, so long as people know. It's really strange, really. And I think current witnesses who are, genuinely looking for truth, or looking at this with an open mind kind of thing, would probably be quite shocked at that comment if they heard it.
Yeah. Well, guys, we must press on, because we have a 3.5 hour program to get through, and we are making good progress thanks to your preparation. So top marks for that. I'll put a G in your books.
We might go past 3.5 hours ourselves.
Maybe. So the next item was my responsibility to listen to, and I did that very, very hesitantly, because it was David Splain, and he gave the item Ezekiel's Temple Vision and You. And similar to your thoughts on Garrett Loesch's talk, Covert, it wasn't a pleasant experience to listen to it. It wasn't a particularly interesting talk. I found myself thinking, gosh, this is the sort of thing where if I was a JW, I would be feeling guilty, feeling as bored as hell listening to this. And now I don't feel guilty, but I've still got to listen to it so I can talk about it. Essentially, it's sort of a change. Well, it is a change of understanding. It used to be considered that the temple mentioned in Ezekiel, or Ezekiel's temple, was the same as Jehovah's great spiritual temple. The governing body have now decided that is not the case, because they've said, well, Ezekiel's temple doesn't have a high priest, and the Day of Atonement... Actually, no, I'll correct myself there. One of the two doesn't have a high priest, and the Day of Atonement isn't mentioned. Essentially, the spiritual temple is an arrangement for worship based on the sacrifice of Christ. It was in existence in Jesus' day and centered around, again, the sacrifice of Christ. Splain said that from Paul we learn about Jehovah's arrangement for worship, and from Ezekiel we learn about Jehovah's standard for worship. He said that according to Isaiah chapter 2, Ezekiel's temple finds fulfillment in the final part of the days when Jehovah's worship is established above the tops of the mountains. So essentially, he was saying that Ezekiel was describing the re-establishment of pure worship in the last days as Jehovah's Witnesses are doing it. That, in essence, is what was said. I'm sure it's going to be thrashed out in gratuitous detail in a forthcoming Watchtower article if I have explained anything poorly or inaccurately. However, I did want to play for you a brief clip.
Now, the title of this talk is Ezekiel's Temple and You. So where do we fit into the picture? Well, it's simple. We are living in the time of the fulfillment of Ezekiel's temple vision. And in the major fulfillment, we find that true worship has been restored. Since when? Well, since when in particular has the mountain of the house of Jehovah been lifted up above the tops of the mountains? Since 1919. What a coincidence. Because in 1919, Jehovah's people were also freed from captivity to Babylon the Great. And so after being freed from captivity to Babylon the Great, now we see an improvement in pure worship, getting better and better. And since that time, Jehovah has progressively guided us to adopt his high standards. Now think about his high moral standards. Nobody is admitted to a permanent association with the organization until they have the approval of the elders, until the elders say yes, and they are acceptable. Now, I think back 65 years ago when I started publishing, and I know that many of you have been publishers a lot longer than that, but I can remember back 65 years ago when I started to publish, I just turned in a report. Nobody asked me any questions. You didn't have to be approved. When you got baptized, you didn't go through the questions with the elders. There were no elders. No more. No more. We can see how progressively Jehovah has raised the standard. And what about unrepentant wrongdoers? They're not allowed to remain in the congregation. That wasn't always the case. So we can see how Jehovah God has been progressively guiding us, leading us to a better and better relationship with him. Now, he's also cleansed his people spiritually. Think about what's happened since 1919, how Jehovah's people have worked hard to keep spiritual uncleanness far away from pure worship, casting off false doctrines and practices tainted with idolatry and paganism. And what has been the result? Jehovah has blessed his people. And there's tangible proof of that blessing. Nations are streaming to the mountain of the house of Jehovah. And they come because they have heard that God is with his people.
So a few things to unpack there. First off, I found it fascinating. Well, I always find it fascinating when I hear Watchtower banging on about 1919, because what's fascinating when you do research into 1919 is that there is zero basis for it in the scriptures. 1919 was essentially picked because that happened to be the year when Joseph Rutherford and his associates were released from jail. There is no actual link in terms of the time periods mentioned in the Bible between 1919 and the Bible. So it's always interesting for me when the governing body reassert that date. He also goes on to make some fascinating statements and claims. He talks about the fact that when he first started being a publisher, which is someone who engages in the preaching work as a witness, he said they didn't even have elders 65 years ago. But what he doesn't mention is that they did have elders further back. They had elders during the time of Charles Taze Russell. But of course, Joseph Rutherford got rid of elders because he wanted more control over the over the congregation. So he made sure there was just a congregation servant in each congregation who answered directly to Watchtower. And when the elders were brought back in the 1970s, that was essentially a flip-flop. How can you talk about the organization improving and constantly being cleansed and refined when you go from elders to no elders to elders again? So I always find it interesting when they talk about that. He mentioned the fact that unrepentant wrongdoers are not allowed in the congregation, and he said that's a fairly recent thing. It is a fairly recent thing. It was in 1952 that disfellowshipping was introduced, but going a little bit further back from that, in 1947, as you may know, there was an Awake article denouncing the practice of disfellowshipping, or at least excommunication was denounced as pagan, as a weapon of control. So again, a very, very kind of varnished, fast and loose version of history, but not going into the nuances and skipping out the interesting points. He talked about the fact that since 1919, God's people have been cleansed spiritually. Well, that's dubious when you look at the appalling problems with child sex abuse. I don't think there's anything spiritually clean about an organization that can't handle something as rudimentary as protecting children. And he said that there is tangible proof of Jehovah's blessing. If there is tangible proof of anything, then it can be objectively verified, and we can start teaching it in our schools and colleges and universities. That is not the sort of language you should be using when you're talking about an evangelical organization that's good at duping people. And he also mentioned that nations are streaming to Jehovah's Witnesses, and as we just talked about with covert, that simply cannot be said at the moment. The figures for last year were awful. Again, we had half of Europe in decline. We had, again, Australia, Canada, New Zealand in decline. If nations are streaming, it's only a certain number of nations, and it's only a certain number of nations that are doing well. So those were my thoughts, I submit, for David Splain's talk. I don't know what you guys make of what I've just related.
Well, I'd have to say the first thing that jumps to my mind is the fact that we're going back into things that are said in Ezekiel and trying to make modern day application of them. And it wasn't just 2 years ago that the Watchtower came out with a very groundbreaking article, which was in the form of questions from readers, where they wiped out what are called types and antitypes. And for anybody that is not familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses, for 100 years, they felt there was a great significance in placing someone like Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and so forth into what they call a biblical drama, where all of these people portrayed things that were happening in our modern day. So there was a direct connection. For example, things in Revelation tied to assemblies and conventions that happened in 1921, 22, 23, the plagues that were mentioned in Revelation. So there was a statement. I have the statement from the Watchtower. It said, "For these reasons, our publications in recent years have emphasized the lessons we can learn from Bible accounts instead of trying to find the typical and antitypical patterns and fulfillments." So I know that Watchtower will draw a distinction between somehow between Ezekiel's prophecies and what are called types and antitypes. But I did find it interesting how much time they spent on this antitypical fulfillment of this spiritual temple or spiritual tabernacle, in view of the fact that they've essentially eliminated that which wiped out dozens of books that many of us studied growing up.
And again, I've probably completely butchered the explanation. I can't say I'm too sorry, but no. Hopefully,
you're trying to explain insanity.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
there is some.
Sorry, go on, Cove.
Sorry, after you.
No, go on, Cove.
I was just the one point I was going to quickly make is that I don't think Splain realized what he was doing, because he was saying, when I was a Jehovah's Witness, we didn't have to turn in all these ministry hours, and we didn't shun people when they wanted to leave, and we didn't have elders.
It was less authoritarian.
Yeah, and I was thinking, I could always hear Louis Armstrong, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world, because he didn't realize what he was describing was the slow evolution from where Jehovah's Witnesses started, where you could say they were relatively liberal under Russell in terms of things like the way they were controlled. And they gradually evolved into this authoritarian, bureaucratic, repressive organization. And Splain's kind of laying it out as if it's a great thing. And I was just sat there thinking, he doesn't realize how he sounds for someone who's left the witnesses.
Very true.
And didn't he also say within that talk as well about the temple being on the highest mountain, so it's above everything, so it was sort of very ivory tower looking down upon all the heathens of the world kind of thing. You can't be anywhere near it.
He made
he
made a point. Thank you for reminding me. He made a point about the layout of ancient Jerusalem, and how the temple in ancient Jerusalem was literally right next to where people were living, so that people could be doing all sorts in their houses, literally only a few meters away from where there was supposed to be worship. And yet in Ezekiel's vision there was supposed to be some massive partition between Jehovah's temple, because it was supposed to be so clean and so pure. And yet again, if this is describing Jehovah's pure worship in the last days, how do we account for the rampant child sex abuse in the organization? What's pure about that? So
the health and safety angel's a bit asleep on the job with that one as well, isn't he?
Oh, well, yeah, more than that, yeah. So we must press on, because next up is John Redwood, who very kindly listened to a talk by Mark Sanderson, recently voted, was it the least controversial or the least unlikable governing body member, Chloe?
I think it was least controversial, because Tony Morris was definitely the most controversial.
Well, Tony's always going to win that one hands down. Anyway, John listened to a talk titled "Never Ever Lose Hope."
Well, I'll say Mark Sanderson is somebody that is just sort of an enigma with Jehovah's Witnesses. It's fascinating to me because he's only about a year and a half older than I am. And growing up, we would have never considered partaking in the 1970s and 1980s, because only persons who had been in the organization their entire lives would partake. And then to become a governing body member, thinking about someone who would have been my age becoming a governing body member, it was completely unthinkable. And yet he started to...
John, are you jealous of Mark Sanderson? That's what it is, isn't it?
I have to say, he's jealous of me because I have hair, but, I never made it to the governing body. Sanderson, he's the youngest of the governing body members, and he's certainly the one that is being sent abroad more than any other governing body member. But they all travel extensively. But the talk was entitled "Never Ever Lose Hope." And so Sanderson starts out by saying, if we've had a friend that's helped us many, many times before in our lives, then that's the kind of person we could trust. So he correlates that to Jehovah. saying somehow that there's proof that Jehovah has helped us, despite the fact that so many witnesses have suffered from death due to blood transfusion policy or sexual abuses that were never handled by the elders or by the police because of that. But he's saying that Jehovah has protected his people so many times that naturally he's the one that's going to be trusted. So that's giving us the real hope. So it's real propaganda from an organization that teaches their members that their only hope is in the words of the governing body as they apply scripture to their lives and tell them, how to live their lives.
Would I be right in saying that he also spoke for a bit? In fact, we might as well play the clip if you don't mind, John, and then you can give us your thoughts on that as well.
Let's do that. It's a very interesting clip about the tragedies that have happened in the past year.
So we'll play that now.
What if you live in Venezuela? Due to the unrest in that country, the reports that we have received as of August the 10th indicate that 47 of our brothers and sisters have been murdered in that land, and many more have been victims of other terrible criminal acts. Our hearts go out to our brothers in Venezuela. What if you live in Texas or Mexico or the Caribbean? Well, you know that we have just had devastating natural disasters. Some of our brothers have lost their homes, their places of worship, as well as virtually all of their material things. What if you live in Russia? In that land, 175,000 of our brothers can now no longer worship Jehovah in freedom.
So clearly, we're familiar with Russia. We also know that witnesses have been affected, as you would expect, by the recent natural disasters. I didn't know that about Venezuela, but it did seem as though Mark Sanderson might have been making himself a little bit guilty of only thinking about the welfare of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, and that's typical of the organization. In fact, if you check out the JW.org newsroom, they're constantly putting articles out saying, well, we've had this tragedy in Texas, for example, from Hurricane Harvey, and none of our brothers were injured or killed. And then later they update that and say, well, yeah, one sister died. But there's never a mention of the overall compassion for the people that live in our society that provide all of our services, our police, our firemen, our doctors, all of the people that are out there trying to save Jehovah's Witnesses' lives, as well as everyone else's, evenly across the board. It's really disconcerting to hear that. Mark Sanderson is sort of the traveling governing body representative that's gone to all of these tragedies. And I think some people have seen your videos about the Philippines and how Sanderson was the governing body member who was sent to the Philippines, and come to find out that I believe it was 12 people were killed inside of a kingdom hall in the Philippines. And those 12 people actually brought the average above the average of people that were killed in general, worldly people, non-Jehovah's Witnesses. So there was no protection from Jehovah physically. And this is the case time and time again. So he mentions the 47 people who died. And, that sounds like a lot, but there are 144,000 witnesses in Venezuela. And the country is in terrible turmoil right now. In fact, one statistic says that 90 persons out of 100,000 per year are murdered in Venezuela. So the crime rate has gone out of control. There's obviously extreme poverty. There's political corruption. There's upheaval going on a daily basis. So, to say that 47 of our brothers and sisters have been murdered really doesn't take into account the real tragedy that's going on across the entire country. And it's very unsympathetic to people in general, which is probably, as most people who are Christians would say, well, that's not what Jesus would teach. He would teach compassion for all people. So failing to mention the worldly people, he mentioned the hurricane in Texas, which was devastating. He mentions Mexico. He mentions the Caribbean, the brothers lost their homes and their material things, but it's only that concern for the brothers. So, essentially his talk was, let's give hope to the weary. And he reads scriptures and says that we can gain strength. We can't focus all of our attention on the problems of the world, which I thought was rather interesting. He talks about the disasters. He talks about the bans, such as the one in Russia. And he says, if we focus on all those things, it's like we're, it's like we're at the Wailing Wall. We're in mourning, but we have to have hope. We have to turn to Jehovah, and Jehovah has unlimited power. And, you could see the response he was getting from the audience. Do you get the
impression that Mark Sanderson might be morphing into kind of the PR guy on the governing body? Because I saw his recent special broadcast about, events in the Caribbean and the recent hurricanes. And it just struck me that he seems to have kind of forged a niche for himself as kind of the human caring face on the governing body when tragedy strikes.
Yeah, it does seem to be that way. He's traveling all over at the expense of Jehovah's Witnesses. And, you might liken it to the fact that the president of the United States traveled to Puerto Rico, which costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring a U.S. president anywhere in the country, let alone the world. And, that money could have been used to help those victims who still don't have power or internet or water in Puerto Rico. And by the same token, Jehovah's Witnesses are, under the same situation. That money, and believe me, that's costing the Jehovah's Witnesses who donate hundreds of thousands of dollars to send these governing body members across to all of these places instead of that money, being given to the actual victims. So
it did feel that the video that I watched, it did feel as though the purpose of the video was to say, listen, this is happening, these witnesses are affected. What you guys can do is bring the donations in. It did feel as though it was not being used as an opportunity to increase the levels of donations.
Yeah. So a couple of things. This talk was really a lead-in to a new announcement, and the announcement was, received a lot of applause. It was the 2018 theme text. So for those that might not know, Jehovah's Witnesses have a theme text every year, and every congregation, every Kingdom Hall places that theme text, which is a scripture, right behind their podium or their platform. And they announced Isaiah 40:31 that says, those hoping in Jehovah will regain power. So that received a lot of applause. That was sort of the announcement that he made. But one of the things that happened during his talk was that they played a video. And so it was a propaganda video in which all of these people discussed the Russian ban. And many know that Mark Sanderson flew to Moscow twice. First, earlier in the year, we had the hearing on whether Jehovah's Witnesses would be banned as an organization in Russia. And then he flew back again for the appeal, which they lost. And so there was a video played in which they describe all of the letters that were written during this massive letter campaign. And, overall, you're right. Sanderson is one to watch because he's been sort of the spokesperson for international travel and the international injustices. And I suspect if they appeal to the European Union, we're going to see more of his face on future broadcasts from JW.org.
Okay, so we best move on. And next up is Chloe, who was listening to a talk titled Protected by Obedience by governing body member Sam Hurd. Chloe, what can you tell us?
So this was sort of very similar to the convention entitled Remain Loyal to Jehovah, more of a rudimentary version where Sam Hurd went through, opened it up with about children being obedient to their parents and quoting Ephesians chapter 6, be obedient to your parents, scripture. And then he related that to us as witnesses, or Jehovah's Witnesses being loyal to Jehovah as the parent. So, and then he went into this illustration about children always ask questions, why, all the time. Why is the sky blue? Why does the bird tweet, etc., like that, things like that. And he said sometimes a parent might just say, oh, because. Or if they've asked them to do something and they say, why? Oh, because I told you to. Which then really leads you to think about what he was trying to apply that to. You could sort of see it coming. He said, well, the child might be too young to understand the reasons why. And it might be very similar in that Jehovah might say, we need to do this now. And you might not understand all the reasons why, that kind of thing. Which really for me is frustrating, because it's basically saying be blindly obedient rather than have your own critical thinking and think for yourself. And it's okay to ask questions, that taking that ability away from people.
So basically Jehovah's Witnesses are to think of themselves as children who don't know better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he kept on saying, trust and obey, listen and be blessed, all those kind of buzzwords around. Just do as you're told, essentially. If we say do this, then you should do it, because you need to trust in God. And then he'll look after you and everything will be fine. If you do exactly what Jehovah says, you'll be absolutely fine and everything will be great, kind of thing. I think maybe we should play the clip now.
I'm glad you've selected this. This is kind of a double whammy of a clip, because we have a bit from Sam Hurd and then we have a bit from a rather bizarre impromptu stand-up routine from Jeffrey Jackson. So,
which was really strange. So just to introduce it, essentially Samuel Hurd, his whole talk was a series of illustrations on why you should just obey and listen, kind of thing. So here we go with the next illustration.
Now here's an example. You're driving a car at night and it's raining. You can hear the rain hitting against the top of the car, and you can hear windshield wipers slapping against the side of the windshield. The lights from oncoming cars are somewhat blinding. All these things are sleep-inducing. You begin to nod. You're about to fall asleep. Your wife slaps you. She's sitting in the passenger seat. She slaps you. You regain control of yourself. Aren't you grateful for the slap? She is. Every meeting we attend is a slap from someone who loves us to keep us awake spiritually. So be obedient, be there, be protected. Your life depends on it.
Thank you very much, Brother Hood. Now, I don't know about you, but I got at least 2 new points out of that. I wrote it down. Don't be thin-skinned and be willing to be slapped. Do you know, I love that talk. I used to give talks like that once, too. And then they made me the chairman. I'm sorry, Brother Hood, I had to wait 12 months to say that.
Chloe, if you're like me, you're listening to that exchange and you're thinking, why on earth are they laughing so raucously? What on earth is going on here?
I was smiling slightly, but I'm smiling kind of awkwardly, thinking, why is the audience in stitches? Why are they laughing so much? It's really like a really bad joke. And because
it's an inside joke, basically, isn't it? I think.
Yeah. To put it into context, he said, I got 2 new points from it, because at the beginning of the talk with Samuel Hurd, he says there's no new thoughts in this talk, essentially. So he said, I got 2 new. It was just, I don't know. I thought it was very strange, that sort of stand up. I don't know. He obviously didn't give a talk like that in this discourse, so he was probably he was just the lowly chairman, as he was kind of saying.
It felt as though he was mocking the fact that he'd been essentially demoted to being the chairman rather than getting to, give a speech on or a talk on prophecy or unveiling some new publication. And it felt like he was joking about that. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I was thinking that that the illustration from Samuel Hurd about going to every meeting we attend is a slap from someone we love to keep us awake spiritually, which is a very strange analogy. I've never heard that before anywhere, and I just kind of was taken aback and thinking, oh, so it's not. It's very difficult to explain, isn't it? Because it's called what? Oh, someone's going to keep hitting you and bashing you over the head with this stuff to make sure that you carry on doing as you're told and stay awake to all of this information we're telling you to. And you need to be there because your life depends on it.
It was truly bizarre. Yeah, I was going to ask you, Covert. You listen to these kinds of exchanges and basically goofing around on the annual meeting platform by governing body members. And are you like me in thinking, how is this supposed to be? How are these men supposed to be conduits with the Almighty?
Yeah, they are. I mean, this is the big discussion that I think's been happening quite a bit. Is the worst mistake the governing body ever made JW.org? Because when I was growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, I didn't know what they looked like. I didn't hear them. I had this image in my mind of very kind, serene, very wise, very caring spiritual men. And the more I see of them, and I kind of left just as they were coming out into the forefront. And one of the things that really caused me cognitive dissonance was Anthony Morris. And I actually saw Sam Hurd give a talk and walked away thinking that's the worst talk I've ever heard. And I think it's no coincidence that so many people who are leaving now, one of the things they cite is that the governing body are crazy. I mean, the infamous one is Tony Morris and his tight pants talk, which seems to really have done the rounds. But I think this general drip of governing body members saying things that are, for example, in the case of Garrett Loesch, things that are very heartless and cruel. Or in the case of Sam Hurd, I mean, the unfortunate thing it sounds like he's saying, we hit you because we love you. Why do you make us keep having to hit you? He almost sounds like an abusive husband in a relationship. And he doesn't realize that's how he sounds. I think that one of the greatest tactical errors they've made in the past 30 years is putting themselves in front of the camera, because they clearly aren't up to the job. And I'll just close by saying, I think there's a phrase, rags to riches and back again, in 3 generations. The first generation makes the money. The second generation maintains the fortune. The third generation didn't have to build it, doesn't know how to make money, and they lose it all. It feels to me like with Watchtower, okay, the early, like Rutherford and Russell, say what you want, and Freddie Franz, they had at least the ability to make something and build a religion. Nor expanded it, and maybe the men of that time maintained it, but it feels like the governing body now have inherited this thing that they don't really know how to maintain, and they're not used to having to fend for themselves. They're not used to having to build things, come up with original ideas. And it really does feel like we're in for this organization is coming apart just at the time when the custodians of that organization really aren't up to the job. And I'm very happy that they're in the camera light, but I suspect they may come to regret the decision.
And there's nothing wrong with goofing around. It's because we all do it. We all do and say things and have moments of frivolity. Yeah. It's just that we're not all saying, I am a spokesperson for the Almighty Creator of the universe.
This is the thing. This is the thing. It's fine to be goofing around and doing stand-up and even doing bad stand-up, but then when you say, "Oh, and by the way, if you disagree with me, you'll never see your family again."
Yeah.
It kind of loses the thrust of the joke then, yeah. And
I think for me personally as well, I sort of didn't know how to take him, because after seeing his testimony at the ARC, I just kind of was like, oh, I'm really confused. You sound like a completely different person, and I just don't understand who you really are and who you were trying to influence, and what it's very strange. It's almost like this Jekyll and Hyde, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. He's actually channeling another personality. It's not his authentic self, which gets us into a much broader issue of who we are as individuals and how the organization overlays a template of this religious indoctrination, which controls everything we say and, you know, it directs our lives.
Yeah.
True. Now, we're staying with Covert because Covert listened to a talk by Stephen Lett. Stephen Lett with his wonderful facial mannerisms, titled "Never Give Up Much for Little." So what can you tell us, Covert?
Okay. Well, I just want to say this is the talk I enjoyed the most, and I'm going to take a very quick little detour to explain why. I'm just going to set the scene. I was listening to this on audio. So I downloaded it to my phone, put my earphones in, and I was walking around actually doing my shopping, listening to Stephen Lett. And I found that as I listened to his voice and I listened to the way he was pronouncing words and his voice going up and down, my brain was filling in the facial expressions. And I could actually have this little virtual Stephen Lett gurning and kind of grimacing away in the back of my head. I was walking down the aisles of the supermarket laughing. So I just want to apologize to anyone who was in that supermarket with me and thought there was a crazy person, because I could see him doing the faces as I listened to his voice. But yeah, I mean, Stephen Lett's talk was interesting. In some ways, it was very generic. It was very much more of the theme that, to a degree, Watchtower has always pushed. But in recent years, they really have pushed hard on giving up your material possessions, your career, your prospects in this world, and instead giving everything you have to Jehovah's Witnesses. It was all about, are you giving up, are you giving up the wonderful things of the future for enjoyment of the temporary world now? His talk was interesting. And much like Loesch's talk, I sat through a lot of it thinking, well, this really isn't anything new or notable. He's just pushing the same party line. But there were a couple of things that I thought were worth noting. The first was that at one point he talks about how Esau gave up his wonderful inheritance to Jacob just for the sake of having some stew. And he says, and the worst thing was the stew didn't even have any meat in it. It was just lentils. I mean, if you come down to Bethel, you can get lentils and something else and meat in your stew from the pantry, and it's all free. And I thought to myself, that's interesting. He thinks the food is free.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's brothers and sisters' contributions.
Yeah.
That you're spending, but to you it's free.
In his mind, it's free. Yeah.
In his mind, it's free. So I just thought that's interesting to just file away. And then it brought me into something else in that he's got this huge contradiction. On the one hand, he's talking about how ideally all the witnesses, probably in his mind, would all go part-time and they'd all throw themselves into the full-time work and they'd completely focus on serving Jehovah. But then, of course, if they all did that, what happens to his free stew in the pantry? Maybe he can't have meat in it anymore because the donations stopped dropping. I know there's sometimes a discussion as to whether or not the governing body know what they're doing or whether or not they're deluded. I mean, I understand that the argument's one way or the other, but to me, this is clearly an idea that they don't comprehend what would actually happen if everyone did what they told them. I don't think Jeffrey Jackson, and I think they'd have to get rid of the pinky rings and the Apple Watches, and they might not have as much free stew in the pantry. The other point I thought was worth bringing out, and if we go into the sound bites, this is kind of an interesting insight for people who are sometimes confused. They don't, because not everyone listening to this, I appreciate, will ever have been a Jehovah's Witness. Some people will think, well, what do you mean by the fact that this organization's controlling? What do you mean by the fact that it's, people just do what it's told? I can't believe that someone would just not see their family because someone tells them to. So this clip by Stephen Lett is worth listening to because it gives you a little insight into what Jehovah's Witnesses are bombarded with all the time.
But what caused Satan to give up so much for so little? Pride. Pride actually caused him to think that he was smarter than Jehovah. Can you imagine that? The clay was smarter than the potter. Pride caused him to think that life without Jehovah would actually be better life. Well, may we never pridefully feel that we know better than Jehovah in any areas. For example, how to treat disfellowshipped ones, the need to avoid bad association, marrying only in the Lord, as a few examples. May we never pridefully feel that the so-called freedom from Jehovah that the world offers will bring happiness. Let's learn from Satan. Never allow pride to cause you to give up much for little.
So I found that fascinating, because what Stephen Lett basically says is that, satanic pride makes you but not do as you're told, when Jehovah, and as we all know in the reality, when the organization says Jehovah says you must do this, what they're actually saying is we say you must do this. To disobey is to be prideful like Satan. And then he lists three things. He lists disfellowshipping. If we decide to ignore what the society says about disfellowshipping, it's essentially prideful like Satan. He mentions bad associations in the same term. And then he mentions marrying outside of the Lord. Now, some of these things are hard and fast rules, but some things are more kind of like strong suggestions from the society. For example, that if you were to go to university, you wouldn't get disfellowshipped for going to university, but it's very, very strongly dissuaded against. And there are a lot of things like counsel on dress and grooming, the way you live your life, that aren't necessarily rules, but the society says we don't think you should do it. Like, for example, bad association. And sometimes you'll hear people try and, apologists for the Watchtower will say, well, there's no rule against that. They just say we don't think it's a good idea. But Watchtower frequently frames these things, even suggestions, as though, okay, well, we're not making a rule about that. But if you disagree, you're being prideful like Satan.
Yeah, you can't get more of a stigma around something than, well, actually, if you do this, you're like Satan. Yeah.
Exactly. And witnesses get this all the time. They are bombarded with this throughout their entire life, day in and day out, to the point where a suggestion from Watchtower isn't a suggestion. In their minds, it is a command. And this is one thing, again, going back to the Royal Commission, a lot of the stuff that came out there was Watchtower was trying to suggest in some of Jeffrey Jackson's discussions with them. He was trying to say, well, they're just suggestions. This is just a suggestion. We wouldn't tell people to do X, Y, or Z. And you hear this sometimes in other areas and other discussions with witnesses. But the reality is, and I think this little clip from Stephen Lett shows, the way Watchtower trains and conditions Jehovah's Witnesses to think is if Watchtower suggests something, well, you won't get disfellowshipped if you ignore us on this, but you're basically prideful like Satan and you're going to die. Mm-hmm. And that's important for people, especially people who've never been Jehovah's Witnesses, and important for people who are lawyers or lawmakers or doctors or people who may encounter these scenarios such as the blood issue, to understand the level of mental control and coercion that the person they're dealing with has gone through. Because the witnesses will probably say, well, there isn't a law about this. This is that person's own decision. But then people need to understand, yes, but that person knows that if they don't do exactly what Watchtower tells them, in their mind, they're satanic and they're going to die at Armageddon. So it's just something I think that's, it's only one part of the talk, but it's an example of the thing that witnesses are told day in, day out throughout their entire life. And I know when I was in it, I understood that basically Watchtower suggestions weren't really suggestions. And this is true for many witnesses. Even if Watchtower says, well, you've got a choice, in your mind as a dedicated witness, you don't really. And I think that's why I selected that little snippet.
And really, all three of us, four of us, all four of us are feeling what it's like to deal with the rules on disfellowshipping. Yeah. And we're having family members who are routinely listening to this sort of rhetoric, and it's like twisting the knife in, isn't it? To know that witnesses inside the organisation are even getting reminded of the need to shun at their annual meeting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to mention as well, to follow on. I thought, like what you were saying, they always turn it into a black or white issue. You're either on Jehovah's side or you're on Satan's side on this. Even on those suggestions, if you really believed it, you would feel extremely guilty if you did any of those things that are strong suggestions.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the final governing body item, and it's my turn. Now, I'll leave you to guess whether I assigned myself this or whether it was just the luck of the draw. But as it happens, for whatever reason, I ended up reviewing Tony Morris's talk, the title of which doesn't seem to have been given a great deal of thought, or maybe it has, which is more disturbing. It was titled Making Our Blows Count. So yes, witnesses need to think about how well their blows are counting. So one thing right out of the gate that he said that was funny, and this ties in with what you were saying, Chloe, about the Green Awards that Watchtower received. He said, "We're not about seeking praise for the quality of our magazines or the hundreds of languages we're translating in." And I instantly thought, John, of your expose on the Telly Awards and the fact that Watchtower was basically caught red-handed, maybe not to do with magazines per se, but seeking praise essentially by buying this Telly Award.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The fact that they do this and put it on their website, and I don't know if we haven't done an article on this, and I need to follow up, but you may have mentioned it in one of your videos, but the Watchtower organization completely removed that article on winning the Telly Award from their website. And I contacted a high-ranking branch committee member and asked him directly why this article was removed. And we went back and forth in about half a dozen or more emails. And it was interesting because then he went to the person in charge of their public relations, and they went back and forth. And essentially, they never answered the question. They said, well, you called it an article. It's not an article. That was removed. It was just a news item.
It's a bit ambiguous as well because Jared Kushner was involved in it, so it could have been because of that. But I just found it interesting that right out of the gate, Tony said something which I know isn't true, which is, "Oh, we're not bothered about seeking praise." Well, I'm sorry, Tony, but your organisation loves seeking praise. We'll even pay for praise in the case of the Telly Awards. I
do.
Just, I'll best get through this. Basically, the theme of Tony's talk was based. He didn't just make up this idea of making blows count out of thin air. Apparently, he based it on 1 Corinthians 9, verse 26. Which says in part, "The way I am aiming my blows is so as not to be striking the air." And he said, if you look around, what he said was essentially, we need to make sure that we're not being wasteful in how we're exerting our energies and our resources as an organisation. He tried to stress the fact, or he made the claim that things are really, really bad, that we're right at the end. He said, if you look around and you don't see how different it is and how close it is, you must be in a coma, which got a laugh. And I'll just say, tying in with what we were saying earlier about Sam Hurd and Jeffrey Jackson and their little, their comedic moments, it was baffling to listen to Tony Morris's talk. And hopefully at some point, viewers, you'll be able to watch Tony Morris's talk for yourself when it's available on JW Broadcasting. When you watch it, just observe the way he effortlessly gets laughs from the audience, even saying the most unfunny things. And I can't figure out whether the audience is laughing because they're intimidated by him, or whether they feel sorry for him, or whether they genuinely find his humour funny. But it's he's saying things. Yeah, that you would not expect people to laugh at if you said it.
It's a study in psychology, really. I noticed this when I was coming out of the organization, and I think we've all experienced this, where we're sitting at a large assembly, 5, 10, 15,000 people, and governing body member or any speaker would make a statement, and you could tell that they were trying to elicit applause, and people would either laugh or clap like seals because they are conditioned to do so. They're conditioned when the speaker raises his voice and he tries to reach that climax. It doesn't matter what he could say. They could say, we now praise Hitler for what he did. They would clap like seals. Now, that's an exaggerated example, but I think it's a study in psychological conditioning of the audience. And if a governing body member says it, then they're going to either laugh if it's a joke, or they're going to clap because this, it doesn't even have to be funny, or it doesn't even have to be accurate. But Jehovah's Witnesses will, they are conditioned to that response.
I think as well, when you're on the platform as much as he is, you kind of get comfortable, and you develop your own kind of body language, and to turn on the laughs just with a little raise of the eyebrow and that kind of. I think that's what Tony does as well. He basically tells the audience when to laugh through his body language. Anyway, that was just an observation. He quotes from Acts 13, verse 48, all those who were rightly disposed for everlasting life became believers. This is actually something that I talk about a bit in my videos, as you know, this whole thing about Jehovah drawing those rightly disposed. This was a point that Tony repeatedly made. He said the focus is those who are rightly disposed. Helping someone not rightly disposed is a, quote, waste of time. No one comes in the truth unless Jehovah draws him. Jehovah draws those rightly disposed. And as I point out in my videos repeatedly, if Jehovah is someone who draws people to him, if you can only be saved or be a follower of God who survives Armageddon, we're basically talking about predestination, because it's out of your hands. You can't decide for yourself, I'm going to be a good person, I'm going to work hard, and maybe I'll get salvation. If it's a case of Jehovah drawing you, not only are we dealing with predestination, we also need to explain why certain countries seem to have more witnesses being drawn out of them and others don't, such as entire swathes of North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So that's another thing.
You're out of luck if you're in North Korea, aren't you? Jehovah doesn't want any North Koreans, apparently.
Yeah, I'm afraid if you're a North Korean, things aren't looking good, quite apart from the current predicament there. So then Tony Morris said that the governing body has identified 2 problems. First, problem number 1, he said, for many years there was a focus on placing magazines and developing magazine routes. He said our literature is the best on earth, which I found very interesting. A slight kind of tinge of Trump there in kind of like exaggerating greatness, and I think those two would get on really, really well, I have to say.
Huge pants, tight pants, the best hugest pants.
The hugest pants ever. I can't believe I just did a Trump impression.
Very good.
They
do tend to speak in these superlatives and these exaggerations and these hyperboles. Very narcissistic and self-serving.
Yeah, there's definitely commonality.
When you were talking earlier, I was definitely thinking that, and I wrote it down, and I thought, I don't know whether I should say that or not.
So anyway, going on about this first problem, he said, some have accepted magazines for many years and not done anything about the truth. But he said, making disciples needs to be the focus of our work. He quoted from Ezekiel 33, verses 31 and 32. They will hear your words, but they will not do them. Their heart is greedy for dishonest gain. So essentially, if you're not taking up the offer that you can't refuse from the governing body, your heart is greedy for dishonest gain. Sorry to break it to you. He said that, this was fascinating. There was just a little nugget in there that caused me to think, is this Tony admitting that he doesn't do the ministry? You know, there's this constant debate: do governing body members do the ministry or not? And there's even been there's been photographs released, including of Tony Morris, where they're seen in the ministry, and it looks like the whole thing's been staged just to show them participating. And at one point, he was talking about people's territories and the fact that people aren't responding to the magazines, and they're maybe taking the magazines for years and not responding. And then he said, that's every territory. You've worked it for many years. You can have faces come to mind just like that. So in other words, he was turning to his audience and saying, well, you know what it's like when you're involved in the ministry. He wasn't saying we know what it's like, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's necessarily proof that they do not.
No, I
go
don't
in the
think it's
ministry.
proof. I don't think it's proof. I just found it interesting. It's not
I think it certainly is minimal, because they're not expected to make any more than a few hours a month because of all their responsibilities. But he did make one statement I thought was rather interesting, and that was that he mentioned working with someone in the field ministry and saying that essentially, I know that you haven't been reading all of our literature. I think he even was snide about it and said, come on,
that's later. Yeah.
You haven't read all the magazines, and, prove to me you've read everything on JW.org and seen JW broadcasting. So it was actually kind of demeaning.
John, I'm getting to that. Come on.
Well,
I'm building up to that. That's my grand finale. Okay, viewers, pretend you didn't hear John say that. That's all I can say.
It's just exuding from me. We were thinking alike. Go ahead.
So, closing his first quote unquote problem, Morris said, our work is twofold: searching for rightly disposed, while the others hear about Jehovah's judgment day. And then he said the second problem is we have so many tools to use in the ministry, it can be overwhelming and confusing. He said our teaching toolbox has become a huge tool shed. Cue audience laughter, because again they were just laughing at everything. He said many struggle to keep up with reading all the magazines, and he basically said that if that applies to you, he said you're not a bad person, which again was kind of a little bit condescending, as though he's in a position to tell someone whether they're a bad person or not. Then he said the governing body is adjusting the focus of our ministry. He said that the helpers and the governing body members were 100% unanimous in doing this. He said Jehovah is the driver, which I found interesting. So he's still claiming that Jehovah is directing everything. And then came the adjustments, which John and some of the rhetoric was included in as a preview, which we arranged in advance.
I should have given the spoiler alert.
That John gave. So, adjustment number one: only 3 public editions of the Watchtower and only 3 of the Awake in a year. Morris said, "I'm excited too. I really am," as though he was basically telling the audience to be excited. This, by the way, I need to show you guys. John Covert and Chloe can't see this, but I'm going to show you, the viewers, now a graph. And the graph that I'm showing now is a graph that features in my book, The Reluctant Apostate, of the reduction in printing from when the magazines first started being reduced. And you can see that every now and then there's this huge dip, and that's when the governing body says, hey, we're reducing the number of pages, or hey, we're reducing the number of issues. That's the one that I did print in my book, but now with this new announcement, I've gone back to my book editor, whose name is Arthur. He's a fantastic guy, and I've said, for my viewers, can you give an updated graph to show what it looks like now in terms of the reduction in printing? And this is the graph that Arthur came back with. Again, the guys can't see this, but you viewers can, and you'll notice that we now have a dramatic decrease in the number of printed magazine pages from when the decreases first started. It's absolutely astonishing the extent to which this is happening. The governing body can and does say, well, this is to simplify things, this is to move the work forward, and so on. My simple argument is, if we are on the cusp of Armageddon, why do we need less spiritual food?
Yeah.
Why were we getting so much spiritual food a few years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can make an argument.
If you're getting close to a pandemic that's going to sweep the world, you start producing more vaccines and antivirals, not less of them.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's definitely, again, it's a psychological lesson that you can make an argument for anything. If you're on a debate team, you can argue that, well, Jehovah's Witnesses need this information. And when I was growing up, we had, obviously we had 2 magazines a month. We had 32 pages each. And the more and more publications they produced, the more it was told to us that this was evidence of Jehovah's blessing. So now they're producing less. And are you telling me that that is evidence of Jehovah's blessing? So you can make an argument for either side, and Jehovah's Witnesses are forced or obliged to go along with it.
Yeah, essentially whatever argument Tony Morris comes up with, or anyone, they're going to buy into it. But for me personally, I mean, we were always taught to take great pride in the amount of spiritual food, and almost the fact that we couldn't keep up with it was something that we were proud of. And now witnesses have to take pride in the fact that there's less spiritual food, and they're on a diet essentially. So the next point, he mentioned about there being one subject covered for each magazine. He showed the first such magazine, which is titled, "Is the Bible Still Relevant Today?" And he said, those that are rightly disposed for everlasting life know they have problems, they're honest about it. So again, if you're not interested in the witness message, it means you're dishonest, you're in denial, essentially, was what was said. He said regarding the magazines, now this for me, I think this was managing expectations. I really do. He said, we'll evaluate after 2 years, and it might be that we think we have sufficient subjects, and then we'll just reprint what's already been written. That, to me, Covert, sounded as though he was preparing the audience for there to be no more public magazines in 2 years' time.
Yeah, it really did sound that way to me. I mean, one of the ways of making a sweeping change that might be unpopular is you do it a little bit at a time and then drop the idea in. I mean, kind of what he did is almost one of the textbook ways. If you're going to do a massive change that you're a bit worried about people taking to, you do a little bit and you float the idea, you might do a bit more, and then they've got time to absorb it. I find it really interesting, like you say, that they are scaling back on what has been their trademark for so long, and from what they loudly proclaimed was kind of one of the markers of why they were the true religion. I'm fascinated to see where this goes, because if they completely get rid of the magazines or scale them back to just three or four subjects that they just repeat ad infinitum, well, it kind of gets rid of the writing department, or you need a lot less people writing things. It's one of the, I mean, in a way, I don't want to speculate too much because we don't know where they're going to go with it. But I agree with you. I would not be surprised if this is the first step towards completely ditching. I think they may have already, as you say, they've already taken the decision to completely get out of this. And I wonder if the governing body had an argument or a discussion about, should we do it all right now or should we do a little bit at a time? And I wonder if this was the compromise that was reached.
I think objectively speaking, though, if I can play the devil's advocate here, you can understand why they're making some of these decisions. Obviously, the print industry is dying, and if not dead, and we've lost so many journals and newspapers over the years.
You can release them as PDFs then, can't you?
Yeah, and that's exactly what they're doing, is they're changing. And I understand that from a standpoint of money, that they're finding how expensive it is to run all these printing presses and maintain them. They cost millions, if not billions of dollars to do that in all of these distribution and printing areas. So, there is an argument to be made that switching over to online is in their interest, although I find it interesting that they're expecting people, not only in the United States, Canada, and other first world nations, but they're expecting people in third world nations to get a hold of these devices, these tablets, cell phones.
This is the other thing. Yeah.
Well, just to kind of, I get what you're saying, and I hear that a lot. That they're still producing the magazines at least, and you can download them online. Here's my thing. If they want, if it was purely about, and I do think that it's a cost thing. I think we can all agree, first and foremost, this is about money, and this is about Jehovah's organization apparently not being blessed enough when it comes to, having enough money to operate at the levels it's used to. But this whole thing about the digital side, it's not like they're saying, well, we're going to write all of the spiritual food that we were writing. It's just going to be available digitally, and we're going to save money on printing. They're actually physically taking out of circulation an amount of magazine pages. So they're saying, well, we're going to go from this many issues to this many issues, to the point where, Tony Morris is saying, well, in 2 years' time, we might not have public magazines at all.
Which, again, is literally less spiritual food. I mean, they're not even going to have the same number of PDFs if they go that route.
Yeah.
It's going to be less writing, less stuff. I mean, like you said, I agree. It's obviously the core of it is money. It's fairly interesting that they can't just be honest about that, and they're obviously having to come up with justifications that they may also believe. I'm going to be fair to them. They may also believe that this is the best way of doing it, but you'll never convince me that money is not a massive factor in what they've decided to do. I just don't buy.
Do you think that the fact that they mentioned in the first part of this that they wanted to create like 420 videos for 2017 in the new studio, so they might be trying to move away from written documents to videos, because I don't know, but just putting across, younger generation watching YouTube and stuff, so they're trying to keep up with this phenomenon of people watching stuff and getting that instant, gratification of
that's a fascinating thing, and I'm glad you've raised that, Chloe, because the whole idea of Watchtower, I mean, what's the tagline of Watchtower? Announcing Jehovah's kingdom. It was the whole reason why it was invented, it was brought into existence by Charles Taze Russell, was to preach the word, was to spread the message of God's millennial kingdom, and to envision a scenario where the Watchtower is only for Jehovah's Witnesses who've already bought into it. And Chloe, you mentioned videos. I agree with you. I think the organization is definitely moving in the direction of focusing on videos. But here's the thing, Chloe. Those videos are for people who have already bought into it. They're no longer, I mean, you can't watch those. It's impossible to watch those videos as someone who hasn't already bought into all of the theology and come away thinking, wow, I really need to look into what these guys are doing.
What about keeping the people who were born into it rather than, because
I think that's the focus.
Even if they're not trying to, because that's the majority of people who leave, from what I can tell, it's a lot of people. That's why perhaps numbers decrease, because you're not getting new people, plus the people who sort of waking up and getting hold of the internet are saying, well, there's so much other stuff out there, and I've found that this is not the truth.
I don't have a lot of sympathy for Charles Taze Russell. I don't particularly admire him, but I do think he would be turning in his grave at the thought that the magazine he introduced to spread the kingdom message is essentially becoming just a newsletter. That's essentially all it is.
This is the thing, and I think ultimately it speaks to the cultural change in JWs that's been happening over the past 30 years. What Charles Taze Russell founded was an association of Bible students, of scholars who could sit down, look at the Bible and think about it and talk about it. And actually, you can say a lot about Russell or a lot about Freddie Franz or the Witnesses of the Year, but they were Bible scholars. And that was always what I thought of myself as. But it really does seem like the intention now, taking away the theocratic ministry school, taking away studies, they're trying to turn Jehovah's Witnesses into a bunch of passive video viewers. The scholarly aspect appears to have really dropped away over the past 30 years. And it's going, well, everything needs to be simple and simple and simple. And it's right, you don't need to read books, just watch videos. And obviously visual media is great and it can be a great tool. But there really does seem to be an idea like witnesses are less and less scholars who can defend their faith and more people who just watch a video and then recite what they're told in that video. There's a real change in what Jehovah's Witnesses used to be. I mean, as I know we often say, it wouldn't matter if I wanted to go back. The religion I left doesn't exist anymore. No,
it's completely different. One more thing they announced, there will be an update on the teaching toolbox. That's a new buzzword apparently that I didn't know about. The teaching toolbox on JW Library. He said, what if it contains a tool that you have found effective? Oh, sorry. I think he said, what if it was difficult to understand what he was saying at times. I think he was saying that if it doesn't contain something that you particularly like, you select it on your JW Library app into your favorites section. And he kind of joked about that. You know, he said it's not a huge deal in case you're getting upset about that, which I wasn't, frankly. Now, we're going to play our final clip for you. And this is the big, or one of the big announcements that Tony Morris made in his talk.
Now, so that's covered those with the preaching and the focus of our ministry. And there's another adjustment that I've been asked to announce here. We all enjoy the latest reports on the worldwide work that we have on JW.org and JW Broadcasting. We love it. And I know recently someone told me they didn't know about Venezuela. Well, it was on JW.org, but you don't want to try to make them feel bad. But there's so much we're getting all throughout the year, and it's timely and a blessing. So with this in mind, the governing bodies decided that with all of the information on JW.org and JW Broadcast, that as of 2018, we will no longer produce the yearbook of Jehovah's Witnesses, especially if you've been in the truth a long time. Yes, the 2017 is your last one. So that's historic, but come on. Try to convince me you've seen everything we've put on JW.org and JW Broadcast. See, God's watching. You're well fed, you got plenty there. So, these latest developments are indeed exciting, and as the end fast approaches, let's honor Jehovah and make our blows count. Let's go forth and make disciples of people that are righteously disposed for everlasting life.
So again, you have more, humor that's not humor at all. I forget the wording there. He said something like, so there's that, and then there's this huge laughter, and that's when he's just announced that the yearbook is no longer going to be printed. And then he says, as John gave us a very helpful preview of earlier, he said, try to convince me you've seen everything we've put on JW.org and JW Broadcast. God's watching. So I honestly, I had a tinge of sadness, I have to say, about the year. Well, a tinge of sadness and a tinge of relief, because I'm trying to collect the yearbooks quite fastidiously, and now I know that I at least don't have to keep up with getting the new ones. This is the last ever yearbook that will be printed, the 2017 yearbook. I got a copy of it at Warwick, and wow, there's a long history, John, of yearbooks going all the way back into the 1920s. I think the first yearbook that was actually a book where the where the text or the summary of the organization was combined with the day's text. That was printed in 1927. There were paperback versions of that going
90 years.
Indeed. So we're talking 9 decades of a certain publication that is now no more. It was, in fact, a historic announcement.
Yeah.
I think it's very significant because there are, along with that announcement, there's a lot of unanswered questions. So while we're not going to have a physical yearbook anymore, Morris didn't really specify whether or not we would see certain statistics that we've been observing very closely over the past decade, particularly the statistics on growth or negative growth of the organization. And then we have the famous statistic of the number of anointed ones, which for many years was drastically dropping until it got down to around 8,000 and then started going up again. And of course, the drop in that number was always supposed to be an indicator of how close we are to the last days of Armageddon, the Great Tribulation. And then those numbers started going up. So I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I'm curious as to whether we're going to see those statistics, because I don't think Morris really specified.
I was listening along. I say listening along. We got the recording to this 24 hours later, but actually during the annual meeting, I was kind of listening in via a web chat with people who were actually there, and they were literally in the audience, which I think that says an awful lot. There were people in the LinkedIn, in some of the LinkedIn audiences who, and in fact, I will say this, there was someone who was at Warwick. There was someone who was actually in the auditorium at Warwick who contacted me and said, "Do you want me to keep you informed?" And I said yes. And so this person was also messaging me on Facebook. So I kind of got the headline stuff. I'm piecing things together. It sounded to me as though there's not going to be any more statistics, but we've since had a letter dated, leaked again from the organization. I mean, how can the organization claim loyalty when there are people actually in the audience at the annual meeting who think it's all a load of nonsense? And then
there's a lot of undercover brothers out there.
Exactly. And then you have all of the details in an official letter leaked out. So I'm now looking at a letter titled Annual Meeting Announcements dated October 7th, 2017. The paragraph on the statistics says, encouraging reports about the activity of Jehovah's Witnesses in other lands are now provided regularly by means of JW Broadcasting and JW.org. Therefore, the yearbook will no longer be published. When the worldwide field service report for the 2017 service year becomes available, this information will be published in the About Us section of JW.org. Now, it doesn't say, a reduced statistics or a version of the statistics. It's I take that as a promise that they're going to keep producing the report in the About Us section and not in the yearbook. However, I agree with those who are saying and who are already saying, well, that's what they say, but what they actually end up doing, remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think that while we're going to get statistics, this gives them more of an opportunity to pick and choose what they feed the flock. So they're going to tell us, well, we've had a 3% increase here and a 5% increase there. They may not ever mention the memorial partakers again. Mm-hmm. They may feel that that's not necessary, and certainly it's been damaging to the organization. There's also a figure in the yearbook which tells the number of dollars that they spend for supporting missionaries and other special pioneers. So I am curious to see if they will divulge that, because if anything, the organization is tight-lipped about, it's about what they're spending and on what areas they're spending that money.
I think one thing we can agree on.
Question mark.
One thing we can agree on is that it's no longer in Watchtower's interest to publish statistics in this much detail. It would have been in their interests back in the day of Nathan Knorr when it was just exponential increase and they were shooting up into the millions and millions. Nowadays, when growth is stagnating and some countries are even experiencing negative growth, and you mentioned the anomaly with memorial partakers, if you're a governing body member, you're thinking, do we really need to share that kind of information when things start turning bad? So again, it's just going to be a case of waiting and seeing, essentially, whether they seize their opportunity to water down the figures.
So after you, Chloe. Sorry.
I just said, or at least omit some or cherry pick the things that they want to share, like you guys were talking about earlier as well.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, like you said, we'll just have to wait and see. If they continue to publish exactly the figures we're getting now, but just do it on jw.org, I'll give them full credit for being transparent about figures that aren't actually that good for them. But if we start to see that the figures they produce, there's figures missing, or it's a kind of a general cherry-picked, edited highlights reel, then I think it'll prove a mindset into the way the governing body think, that they are prepared to, that they know the stats are bad, and that B, they are then prepared to hide those stats from the witnesses. But we'll just have to see what happens.
Indeed.
Well, Covert, I'm glad you have the theocratic wait and see attitude. Well done.
Taste and see that Jehovah is good. So, apologies for triggers there, everyone. Now, as we sweep past the 2-hour mark, or at least that it's 2 hours here, it might not be for viewers. I'd better wrap up now. We've just listened to the end of Tony Morris's talk. There were then some additional announcements after he left the stage. There's going to be changes to the study edition. Jackson said that since 2011, it's been that there's been the standard edition and the simplified edition. There's going to be a new design for the standard edition with larger font style and expressions explained. But the governing body has decided that as of the 1st of January 2019, the standard and the simplified will be combined. Jackson added that actually many of the larger languages, such as Spanish, have already had this happen, so they've already been combined. But then he said that, and I found this curious, he said an electronic version of the English simplified will be produced, but mainly for translators. So on the one hand, they're combining the two, but on the other hand, they're kind of keeping one of them for translators for some reason. He said early next year, a new publication will be released, How to Remain in God's Love, 256 pages, the same simplified style as the Teacher's book, replacing the God's Love book. And then he gave the attendance, which was 671,126 combined. So fascinating that, well, the stuff about the study edition wasn't that interesting, but again, you have the God's Love book being kind of ditched and replaced by a simplified version of the God's Love book. And the simplified version of the Bible Teach book now essentially becomes the chief Bible study aid.
Yeah.
And when you read the letter that I was quoting from earlier, and you read the details, essentially the Bible Teach book's now being phased out, and any copies that are still in circulation, offer them to people, but those are the last ones essentially. Incredible to think that so relatively recently this was new spiritual food, hot off the press, and already it's yesterday's news.
Yeah, I must admit that my reaction to this was hearing everything's getting even more simplified. It's like, what are they going to do in 2 years' time? Announce that everything's being just drawn in crayon. Yes, Jeffrey, the reason that people are not flocking into your religion is that your publications are too intellectual and too complex for people to understand, and your weighty wisdom just needs to be watered down for the thickos so that they may flock to your gates. I heard that and I thought, you know what, you guys don't understand the problem.
They do seem to think that it's just a matter of, well, this is too complicated for people. We need to kind of explain it more simply. It's
probably too complicated for some of the governing body, but
One thing that's intriguing is the question mark of what's going to happen to the Jehovah's Witnesses who are still engaged in the door-to-door ministry. While we all know about the mobile cart witnessing work, the witnesses are still obligated to do the door-to-door work. And for many witnesses, they have relied, going in the field ministry for many was a matter of going and knocking on a few doors and then doing what they call return visits. And return visits were always presenting the latest magazines. And so essentially what they're saying now, and I think Morris brought this out, was that, look, we're going to give them this sampling of Watchtower magazines that are going to remain static. And if they don't progress, we're going to move on. But witnesses for decades have had what they call magazine routes or route calls, where they go and bring them the latest Watchtower. And it's sort of mindless. They just show up every month. Here's the latest magazine, or every 2 months. And I think it's going to somewhat affect the mindset of the average witness who's just skating by on going out for an hour or two every other Saturday and doing the return visit work where they go back, and now they're going to have less material to throw at the householder or the person at the door. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but
there's definitely a
return
shift.
visit.
There's definitely a shift happening, and magazine route calls, or route calls, as you Americans call them, are yesterday's news. The direction now is to start conversations. Guys, we better start wrapping up. But Chloe, I wonder if you could kind of sum up your thoughts on the annual meeting in general. How would you do that?
Summing it up, I thought that there were a lot of facts and figures thrown at people to take up time in the meeting material. A lot of it was very simple stuff. Conversely, there was also quite complex things to do with prophecy, which I'll be very honest, when I was listening on the train, I was kind of lost, and I was thinking this doesn't really make sense, and it kind of still doesn't. And quite generally, it's kind of anticlimactic, really, from what I would have imagined happening, and happy things and announcements and more stuff and more activity. It's kind of feels like a dwindling down. Yeah, even the way Tony Morris announced that they weren't going to print the yearbook anymore, he was like, well, and that's that.
Yeah,
it was
a shrug of the shoulders.
Yeah, it was like, oh well.
And Covert, your summing up thoughts?
Very similar, really. They had 45 minutes worth of information that they stretched out to 3.5 hours, which unfortunately, that used to happen in a lot of things I used to have to sit through as a witness, and it always annoyed me. It was in some ways a damp squib of a meeting, but in other ways it does illustrate the continual decline. Things are getting simpler. They're cutting down on their flagship programs. Their flagship publications are going away. The overall trend, I tend to agree. My own personal opinion on the organization is that the rot has begun, and what this was quite half-hearted in some ways in what they actually had to say, but also if you read between the lines of what's announced, you can see that the decline continues, and I think it will be interesting to see what happens over the next few years.
Indeed. And John, your thoughts, summing up?
Yeah, I think it's just important to note the psychological impact on witnesses, and that remains to be seen. But to me, the change is always difficult. And while most witnesses clap and embrace it, I think the changes in patterns, the way of lifestyle of having this Watchtower magazine, that they've always said that the Watchtower is sort of as Covert mentioned, the flagship of the organization, and they've drastically reduced it over the years. And this is the greatest reduction, 3 magazines a year for 2 years, and then they go static. So, overall, I would say my impression is that once again, they are subtly altering the patterns of Jehovah's Witness culture. And whether people will wake up as a result of this and their changes and their prophecies and policies, that remains to be seen. But I certainly hope that people do research this on JW Facts and Survey and online, and by doing videos like this that allow us to think about those changes and whether or not we were really part of the truth to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Can I just say one more thing as well? I think people might forget that all of these things are affecting real people too. So they're going to cut down all of these things that they're doing, and there are real people who've done these jobs in Bethel's and have been volunteering for many, many years, and it's been a real core part of their life, and it won't be anymore all of a sudden for some of these big changes. So like the printing, etc. So
yeah,
absolutely. Have to remember that too.
Indeed, there's reductions in printing will mean reductions in personnel. We've already seen huge cutbacks in Bethel staff, and as easy as it is as ex-Jehovah's Witnesses to say, well, you should have got out sooner, you should have figured it all out. It's not that simple when you're inside, and you can.
That could easily still be us.
Exactly.
Different circumstances, quirk of fate. That could still be us.
Precisely. So it's worthwhile just having a little bit of sympathy for those still inside. Well, listen, guys, thank you so much for joining me to go over this. We may have passed the 2-hour mark, but at least we haven't passed the 3.5-hour mark. So it's still an economy compared to being there live, and hopefully a little bit more interesting content than actually being at the event itself. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I hope it won't be long before we have Watchtower in Focus number 5. I do think we are turning this into a tight-running ship and figuring this out as we go along. And it's been a pleasure going over this with you. So if you're a viewer, I hope you've enjoyed this. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos. And as always, thank you for watching.
Say to the world I'd die if we were falling apart. Going to work, smiling as we're falling apart. You lie to your friends as fine as you're falling apart.